It's cold here. It's actually snowing where I am. I don't know about you guys, but when it's cold outside, it just makes me want to curl up with a hot coffee and read. And it got me thinking, what are some of the best books that describe the cold or take place during the cold weather or just make me think about being cold? So I grabbed a couple off the shelf here. I've got mostly prose novels. So we'll start real light. Real light. There's not very much cold description in these. But when I think of the cold, I think of space. Being trapped alone in space. These books, it was hard to pick one, so I just grabbed them both off the shelf. Of course, this one's more being alone in space, and whereas this one is more just being out deep in space, not necessarily alone, if you've read the book. If not, highly suggest both of these. Really good sci-fi, really good writing, really interesting concepts here, really fun science to go with the science fiction. And yeah, when it's cold outside, I just think of being in space, like aliens, like you're trapped in space. No one can hear you scream. I also think one of the best series to describe the cold has got to be Song of Ice and Fire. So everyone knows what this is at this point, right? If you haven't read it, definitely read it still, even if you've watched the show. The books are great. George R.R. Martin has a way of describing the cold that is beautiful. Of course, if you've seen the show or read the books, you'll know about the wall. The North is so cold. There's a point where they leave the wall and they're traveling, and he describes the snow, and it's so cold. People are dying because it's so cold outside. And I think about this whenever it gets really cold. I think about some of those scenes with the army marching through the cold and just how deadly it is. And it's just a great series, man. Those are awesome books. But I also think of Jon Krakauer, Into the Wild. This is one of my favorite nonfiction stories. And very quick read. Obviously, it's not like Game of Thrones. It's going to take you years to read it all, really. This is a quick read. You can read it in just a few days. And it's about a guy being trapped in Alaska in the cold. And it's brutal. What he goes through is brutal. And I just think about being trapped alone out there in the cold. This is a very inspiring book. It makes me want to go to the woods. But it's also very scary and very humbling because nature will kill you. Speaking of killing you, so Donna Tartt, The Secret History. Might seem like a weird choice. There's a scene in this book, a whole chapter, a couple chapters maybe, where a character from the book is in the winter time. He's not in the best situation. He's living in a place that doesn't have heat. And he actually almost dies from hypothermia. He gets found just laid out in the snow. He gets found by a friend, and he's basically on the verge of death, and he would have died if he hadn't been found. And I just always think about that. It's actually not a huge plot point in the book itself, but that scene just stuck with me. It's one of my favorite parts of the book, really, where our main protagonist here is sort of dealing with the cold. And I wanted to love this book a lot more than I actually did, but I really did like that part of the book. It's a good read. Donna Tartt is an amazing writer and has won all those awards for a reason. This also makes me think of the cold. Scott Smith, A Simple Plan. This is a really sad book. It just made me so sad when I read it. It's enthralling. I could not put it down. I read this book in probably a day or 2 days because I just couldn't stop. It's so good. And it's basically about a couple of guys, a group of, I think, 3 guys that find an airplane that's crashed in the snow. And they find a suitcase or a briefcase with a bunch of money, like millions of dollars in it or something, hundreds of thousands of dollars. Enough money to change your life, right? So they decide to take the money. But just being in the snow and just seeing them, try to make all these decisions, and it's horrible decisions, and everything goes wrong, and you don't know who's going to get caught. They go back, try to cover their trail, but it's in the snow, so you could see their tracks through the snow to the airplane and back. Like, obviously they were there, and it's just you're on the edge of your seat the whole time reading this. And man, it's really devastating, really sad, just like his other book, The Ruins. But I actually like this book. I actually like this book better than The Ruins, I think. So I just have a couple more here. So Road of Bones. I went through, I kind of looked at my shelves. There's a ton of books I left on the shelf. Like The Shining, that's a good one, when you think of the cold. But I did grab The Road of Bones because this is about literally a road of bones. It's a road that was built in the coldest part of the world, where people were dying as they were building their own, and their corpses were just being frozen, and they just kept going. So the road is just paved with bodies that they couldn't exhume because it's too cold. And Christopher Golden does a great job of describing the cold, and I felt, horrible reading this. It's a pretty good horror novel, pretty quick read as well, but just the premise of it made me think of the cold, of course. So I actually don't have very many graphic novels on the list. I really just have this one. I kind of looked through. I didn't see anything that really stood out to me except for this, Blankets by Craig Thompson. Yeah, this screams cold weather. This is a very different book than the rest of them on the list. This is just a very beautiful story about being young and in love, and that first time you fell in love with someone. And a lot of this book takes place in the winter. I think pretty much all of it does. You can see the cover there. They're in the snow. So this is a black and white graphic novel. So you can see they're getting dressed up. They're going to go out into the snow. And yeah, this book just has a very cozy feeling. And it just makes me think of being out there in the snow, wrapped up in a blanket. It's called Blankets for a reason. It's just got that feel of just being very cozy, and it's very beautiful. It's very sad. It's kind of tragic, as most young love is, right? So this is actually the only graphic novel on the list, Blankets. I could have grabbed some more, I'm sure, but this is just what stood out to me. I just have one more. Most of those that I just said, they aren't in any kind of order, really, except for number one. The number one book here is definitely number one. When I think of the cold, I think of The Terror by Dan Simmons. One of my favorite books of all time. It's got to be one of my top 5 favorite books ever. It's a huge book, and I just burned through it. It was so good. It's like a historical fiction. You would think it was not as good as it is. It's so good. You'll see this on a lot of people's list of like best horror novels ever, and it really is. It's amazing. It made me a huge Dan Simmons fan, and I've read several of his books since reading this one. Was my first one. Nobody describes the cold as well as Dan Simmons. These guys are out here, and they get trapped in the Arctic, trapped in the ice. Their ship literally gets frozen in the ice, and it can't move anymore. It's stuck. And I never thought about something like that happening. These guys are suffering from frostbite, hypothermia, starvation. It is brutal, it's devastating, and it is horror. There is a creature or something, a beast, something is out there with them, trapped in the Arctic, and it's really scary. And yeah, man, when I think of the cold, this is like the ultimate book I think of when I want to read something in January, February, when it's so cold and it's snowing outside. This is the book. If you haven't read The Terror, this is the one you got to go read. So yeah, I would love to know what you guys think. Do you have anything that I missed? I'm sure there's some really great books that describe the cold. I'd love to hear from you guys. See ya.